our culture as a whole tends to look towards the indigenous cultures of the earth as having held themselves back because of their superstitions. And shamans represent this to the nth degree.
Yes, and I think there have been two extreme views. One has been the kind of very critical intellectual academic stance that sees so many shamanic practices and tribal practices in general as being only superstitious. And then there's the other extreme, which is unfortunately fairly common in our culture now, with a kind of uncritical acceptance of everything that native peoples or shamans do, and it's all wise and all wisdom. And my own view is that really it's a mixed bag. There's some of both, that among shamans and other tribal practitioners one can find limiting beliefs and superstitions which really are detrimental to health and the well-being of themselves and the community. But one can also find very sophisticated psychological, spiritual techniques for inducing experiences in themselves, in others, for helping, for healing, which may at first look superstitious to us because we're from a different culture. But if we're willing to look past that, we can begin to appreciate that there's real wisdom there. So my own take is that there's some of each there. And one of our real tasks in our contemporary time as psychologists, as scientists, is to try to disentangle what's actually just destructive superstition and what's really very constructive technique.
How can we begin to do that?
Well, that's the nature of research. I think first of all we have to open our minds to the possibility that these people do have some wisdom. Secondly, look at their practices as carefully as we can in the light of what they have to say about them. Test the techniques out. Do they work or do they not? I think that's really the key thing. And then also look in terms of light of some of our most modern contemporary understandings, for example, of psychosomatic healing or the power of hypnosis or the placebo effect. These are very, very powerful techniques as we now know, but only not so many years ago we dismissed them completely. Now we can begin to appreciate that these powerful techniques are used very skillfully by some of these tribal healers.
Yeah. One of the most intriguing aspects of shamanism to me is that shamans are often referred to as the wounded healers, that they've attained their status in their community because they became ill and healed themselves, and as a result of healing themselves, they actually enter into a higher level of functioning.
Yes, that's an intriguing thing. And I think we can look at it in several ways. The simple way is the idea that all of us are familiar with, that if we use our own suffering skillfully, it can be the birthplace of compassion, to understand and empathize with the suffering of others. And that's a very important healing process. Those who suffer are able to empathize with others who suffer. But then there's another process which you alluded to, and that's the fact that some shamans, not all, appear to go through what's called an initiation crisis, an initial period, usually in late adolescence, of psychological discomfort, disturbance, which is usually recognized by the tribal peoples and other shamans as a sign of a shaman to be. And this actually is very interesting, because this initiation crisis was one of the reasons that we thought a while back that shamans were psychologically disturbed. But now, just in the last decade or so, we have the concept of what's called the spiritual emergency or spiritual emergence, the recognition that a number of spiritual practitioners can be called to their work by virtue of a developmental crisis. And that developmental crisis is both the signal and the catalyst for them to enter into their spiritual work, to be called to that domain of experience. And the shamans are the earliest examples of this. Of course, though, throughout history we have classic examples like the Buddha and many other great spiritual heroes who confronted an initial crisis, a kind of existential spiritual crisis, and from that entered the healing and spiritual profession.
I have to think that from a scholarly point of view, there's something very interesting going on. And in the last several decades, there's a whole new body of research and theory coming out in parapsychology and transpersonal psychology and the study of altered states of consciousness, the study of near-death experience, in which we can look at individuals in our own culture who are having the kinds of experiences in different contexts that shamans have always reported.
Yes, it's interesting that we've gone from a very hyper-intellectual, science as God culture which has tended to dismiss the subjective, the inner, the spiritual, in the belief that science, technology could really answer all our needs. And I think we've seen very clearly the limitations of that, and we see it in our environment and the destruction of our planet and various other things. And I think also we feel it in the hunger which we as individuals and as a culture experience, the lack of meaning and purpose that goes with a focus on the material and the technological, and the realization that the inner world, the psyche, will break through, it will express its deepest yearnings for meaning and purpose and connection with the whole. So that almost as we can see our culture as a whole going through a developmental, evolutionary, spiritual emergence, we might say, in the same way as individuals do, and as you pointed out, the same way shamans have for centuries.